So I'd like to ask you guys some questions. So Mala kind of said, I forget what word she used, a longtime wit champion, which, you know, I like to tell people I'm not old, I'm experienced. So on my normal slides, I say I've been doing this for 20 plus years, this whole being a woman and in tech thing, but it's more than 30. So I wonder about you guys. How long have you been a wit?
For about 20 years. I graduated from college in December of 1999 as a single mother of a 3 and 4 year old. Well, they were probably 4, 5, and 6 by then. But I'd gone back to school and graduated and got my first technology job in like 22 years ago.
So. Yeah, so here's your tip on your slides, just say 20 plus years.
I do, that's exactly what I say, is like 20 plus years.
Yeah, because when I tell some of my coworkers that I've been doing this for 30 some years, they're like, what? Did they have computers back then?
I'm about that much too. I started actually working with women's causes when I was in college, even before I graduated, and then many kinds of experiences there, and then I took a break when I was working until I came to this country because of some unpleasant experiences I had. The area of women's rights, especially in India, it's a very different than what it is here. It has its own challenges and its own gains. So I was both inspired, and at times, you know, something happened that really let me down in a big way. So I took a break from it for some time until I started working with SQL Server and joined PAS and the Women in Tech group. So about that.
That's really cool. Yeah, for a few years, I was lucky enough to be Canada's national spokesperson on women in technology. And that was really interesting, with both the support I had for that, like for public speaking and media access and all of that. You know, it was really cool. But one of the things is it also kind of made me a target for people who felt that women should not be encouraged to go into jobs for which they are not qualified, is usually how it was explained to me.
Right.
Often by people who had much fewer qualifications than I did. So, yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. It just so happened when I was invited that I'm working on a longer version of this presentation, which will be a full day, a pre-con in the SQL Server world, but a full day workshop along with a good friend and colleague of mine, Lynn Silverstone, who is active in data modeling and data architecture. And we're giving not the same presentation, but a similar one about how to get through your day with teachings from ancient thought leaders. And that one's going to be a full day at the Data Governance and Information Quality Conference in June of this year. And I said, my name's Karen Lopez. I never know what to pick for a title because, you know, I'm CEO, president, founder, and chief bottle washer at Info Advisors. I tweet a lot at DataChick. I am active on Facebook, and I sometimes post some things to LinkedIn. And the key is I'd love to follow you, friend you, or link with you, especially if you told me we met here. Even if you're watching the recording, we met here. This is the same slide that Mala showed, and I already had one where I wanted to give some caveats, is that, of course, none of what I'm doing here is meant to treat any mental health issues, although I will be talking about my own. I am clearly, as someone with an undergraduate degree in computing systems, I am not an expert in philosophies or these frameworks. I personally am not a religious person. So while I will be drawing from some frameworks that some people practice as a religion, I don't. I will have a couple of stories just here in the beginning as a background about some things about office conflict, harassment, and bullying, but that is certainly not the focus of this session. There's so much here to learn, and I'd love for you to take away tools and practices and tips, but again, no treatments. So my goals for everyone is to enjoy this by having fun, to be able to learn 3 things, 3 takeaways, and that's a big number of takeaways for an hour-long presentation. Usually I say at least 1 good point, but I'm hoping that you all will be wanting to take away, find 3 things that you didn't know before. And I'd also encourage you to share your own tips for personal wellness on Twitter and social media, because that's how we share. So I'd like for you to think about, you know, your kind of day-to-day work. So this particular presentation is based on, like I said, some ancient thought leaders, some really good quotes, and I'm going to apply it to data just because this is Women in Data platform. Of course, any of these things apply to any places that you might be needing to use it. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about my background. I went through a time in my life just a few years ago where I was having conflicts at work. I was being bullied and harassed across all my social media platforms, on my own blog. Some men made videos about me to post to YouTube where they made some true claims, some false claims, and said very awful things. People were in a Facebook group where they put things in there like where to find me, my address, which is not secret, so I'm not going to consider it doxing, but to say to go to her house and take her down, whatever that meant. This was a really hard time for me, and most of the community that I was active in didn't stand up, didn't ask them to stop. The posts were left up. People filed complaints against me for the Microsoft MVP program, including such horrendous breaches of rapidly leaving an after event social event without telling anyone goodbye. That was one of the complaints. And in that particular sense, I actually removed myself from a social situation where things were getting out of hand. And I did not announce that I was leaving because, in my opinion, the best way to leave a situation where you feel you're at risk is to get up and leave. And that's what I did. Also, at the same time, my 25-year marriage was falling apart with betrayal, including my ex-husband embezzling a bunch of money from my company that he didn't have ownership in, as well as getting harassing and bullying from some of his, let's call, close friends. People were coming to my home, vandalizing my home, sending me postal mail, because you can't block postal mail, with photographs and all kinds of awful things. I was really getting slammed emotionally and physically, and it was all just awful. And so that's when I started looking at, you know, what can I do out there besides therapy, besides being treated for depression that I was going through at that time? What sort of ways could I deal with all of this stress and all of this pressure that was going on? I mean, I had technical things I could do. I could block people on social media, and I certainly did, only to have people use other people to nag me to unblock them. And in fact, the fact that I blocked people on social media was also used in a complaint against me, as if these privileged people had a right to see my tweets because they were important. I'm not sure. So I'd like for you to think about conflicts you have at work or in person, just that are really common. So not necessarily the big ones I just mentioned, but the typical ones I might have at work are maybe, let's say, I'm a data architect, not a DBA, but I have to work closely with them. And I say that data architects, data modelers often are compensated, measured, and rewarded for doing exactly the opposite thing. So I consider that a natural conflict. So for instance, a DBA might say, you know, their number one job is keeping the database up and making it perform well. That's what they're measured, compensated, and rewarded for. Whereas my job as a data architect is often to make sure the data has sufficient quality, that it's right, that the right data is there at the right time, that calculations are happening well, that customers are happy, that end users are happy, and that I understand a bunch of things that are both technical and business oriented, because I'm spanning that group of people, turning business requirements into data models that become databases. So there's a natural conflict there. So for instance, in one of my contentious issue talks, I talk about whether all nulls are evil or whether nulls are something that we need to support in a database. And that's practically a religious debate in the data world, and I'm not going to get into it here, but it's kind of funny that there is this natural conflict in the data world between performance and accuracy. It's just a natural one. So how do we deal with that? Some other conflicts are things like, you know, people assuming that because either I'm very experienced, meaning old, or because I'm a woman, or because I'm living in Canada, you know, whatever trait they want to pick for me and say, you know, you couldn't possibly know what I know, right? And people make those assumptions, and sometimes that gets in the way of getting stuff done. And there's certainly a ton of stuff that I don't know. I think that's something natural that comes out of experience, especially if you have multiple decades, is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And I also would like you to think about some of the common, like lighter conflicts you might have at work. And I'd love to see you put them in the chat or the Q&A so that we possibly the moderators can bring them forward. They don't have to be detailed or anything. One of my other natural conflicts is between program managers, project managers, and me, because they want to know, how long is it going to take me to get the database design done? And that's pretty much an impossible question to answer if you don't know the scope of the project, if you don't know what business processes are going to change, if you don't know what data already exists. But somebody says, you know, it should take you about a week or two, shouldn't it? And I'm like, no, it should take me, you know, we can get started in a week or two with some database designs, but I'll be finished with the data model and the database design when the project is done, because that happens constantly throughout a project. So I'd like for you to think about what are some of those common conflicts you've had, debates, arguments, different points of views, not getting your way, and how you normally respond to them. Oops, sorry. So some of my challenges I had, I touched on them a little bit. I suffer from, as do most women, more women than men, suffer from imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome just means that you realize the more you know, the more you learn, the less you actually know about a subject matter. And the specific thing about imposter syndrome that people have is that at some point in a meeting, someone's going to find out that you don't know everything about a subject. That's this sort of ongoing anxiety that happens. I'm having it right now, giving this talk about philosophies that I'm not an expert in and things that I've cherry-picked stuff about. But I also know that these things helped me. So I'm feeling brave enough that someone's going to call me out on the fact that I am not an expert in philosophies or these frameworks. So, you know, if they do, I'll have the tools to deal with it. I told you about my crushed confidence when I was going through all of those awful things in my life, all at the same time. I'm still getting over that, but one of the ways I'm getting over that is going back and doing my work, living my best life, choosing to do the things that I enjoy, but still doing the hard work that goes along with those things. But at the end of my sort of what I call my big life falling apart thing was I was just kind of left with, what the heck is going on? How did my life go from being financially successful? I thought I was doing pretty well, professionally successful. And then all of a sudden, everything just came to a crushing halt. And that's why I looked at these tools. Now, having said those negative things, I just wanted to be honest about how I came to this place. But I want to say there's good news. A lot of people told me, one of the things that's really weird about me was that when all this stuff is going on, I chose to share it publicly. A lot of people going through these things, that doesn't help them. For me, it helped me because I had sort of a circle of friends, some of them who were already really close, some of them who were acquaintances who became really close because they had been through these things. People I had no idea who had traveled these paths before came to me and told me, and pretty much the most common response I got was, I know this really hurts now, but I promise you, you will get better. And I didn't believe a single word they said, but here I am. It did take a long time, but here I am, and things indeed have gotten better. So one of the first frameworks that I wanted to talk about is Stoicism. So I always laugh about Stoicism because even when I went into learning about this, if I thought of the word Stoic, I thought of someone who showed no emotion, someone who was completely calm at all times. So think about Mr. Spock on Star Trek, or Data, who didn't have an emotional chip, just someone who could be factual, logical, and had no emotions. And to me, as someone who's really emotional, that sounded like nothing I wanted. Even though I was feeling emotions that I was not happy to be dealing with, that was not my goal. But when I started looking into it, I found out that's not really what Stoicism is. So this is a Greek, it started out as a Greek school of philosophy, and some of the big names of quotes you might have seen, because these people who were working on this and developing it, you know, they also have some really great quotes, some that I'm going to share with you. But this might have been Seneca or Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, and I always have trouble pronouncing these names. The main thing about Stoicism was it's not about hiding your emotions. It's absolutely about recognizing and feeling your emotions, but properly choosing your response so that you're taking the right path after. One of the other key things, which was a big learning lesson for me during this time, is that people will show you who they are before, no matter what they say they are. And I know that's also a quote attributed to Maya Angelou, who also has some great quotes on how to get through a day. One of the things that I want to point out as I go through these is there's a whole lot of things in common that all of these frameworks have, even though they might have been developed centuries apart or years apart, and that were found and developed by people who lived in different cultures as well. So I wanted to make a comparison between Stoicism and data architectures. So Stoicism is definitely a philosophy. It's not a religion. It's tied to your own personal ethics of doing the right things, of living within nature, not fighting it. It's a lot based on logical thinking. It's a belief that destructive emotions are harmful. So not emotions are harmful, but holding on to destructive emotions is harmful. And what you do always outshines what you say. Compared to data architecture should be a philosophy and not a religion, even though I think I've come close to thinking about data as a religion. At least I tell people I was born this way, to be a data person. I think our data ethics are embedded with our own personal ethics. So one example I draw from my real life is I had a conflict with the DBA. We were developing a travel-based point of sale system, reservation system for a very large travel provider. And I had modeled that people can have multiple sexes over time, that they can have multiple genders at the same time or over time. And he flat out refused to deploy that DDL and that data because it was against his personal beliefs. So he did not believe in people being able to have multiple sexes or multiple genders. And so he was like, I'm not doing this until you make it so that people can only, there's no difference between sex and gender, and people can only be male or female. I'm not going to deploy it. And that was kind of an issue for me, especially since one of our first proof of concept customers was going to be a travel agency that specialized in LGBTIAQ communities. And I thought, you know, they're not going to be happy. Their requirements will not be met. But it did have to get escalated to executives, not managers, but executives at the company, to tell him if he wasn't going to support the business requirements, he needed to find a new job. So instead of that, they hired a second DBA for the project who was quite happy to deliver the requirements. But in that conflict I had with that DBA, I knew it was not going to be worth my time trying to change the DBA's mind on that they were such closely held personal beliefs that on principle, he was not going to do his job. So I worked around that. I escalated it and said, you know, this is a business requirement. This is a customer facing issue. We have to have it deployed. So they found a way by hiring someone else to run this DDL. But there's been a lot of talk recently about data ethics, and I have to keep reminding people that, you know, the data itself doesn't have ethics, the system doesn't have ethics. It's we, the designers and the implementer, that embed our ethics into those things. I also think data architects should live in the real world, which means that, you know, if you don't believe that people don't have first names, or some people don't have last names, or a lot of people don't have middle names, and you want to force your world onto your customers in your database designs, you're not living in the real world. And a lot of these frameworks talk about being present and being mindful of what the world actually is, what Stoicism calls living with nature, like actually being aware of what the world is around you. I think emotions in data architectures are kind of weird unless your system is about emotions, but I'd love to hear a counterpoint on that. I also believe that what you declare in your data model outshines what you believe. So some of the other things about Stoicism that really helped me is this big focus on wisdom and temperance. Now, temperance here doesn't mean anti-drinking. It means not letting destructive emotions overcome you. There's a lot about courage. The people who did a lot of the writing, Marcus Aurelius in Meditations, talks a lot about courage, like how to manage your courage, how to act. Don't wait till you feel courageous, just act courageous. And also a lot about justice, meaning do the right things and don't hang out with people who do the wrong things. And I've really taken thousands and thousands of pages of writings and, you know, summarized it down to just a few slides. So these are some, the other thing about Stoicism, in that it's not a religion, there's no one book or resource to go to learn about the official dogma or teachings of it. But there are some common practices that you'll see. The reason I'm listing them here is because they also happen in other frameworks. So some Stoic practices: accept what is beyond your control. So this is the same thing we see in Buddhism, in AA meetings, in all kinds of belief systems, that the first thing you need to do is be able to decide what's in your control and what's not. So with that DBA who wouldn't deploy that DDL, he was not in my control. I could not fly to Atlanta and force him to type these things into his computer. That was beyond my control. But what was in my control was the ability to escalate the decision so that the business could make that decision on what requirements they wanted to support in their system. Another is act with the right intentions. And throughout all these belief systems, the word right is used a lot. And what it means is the just way. It doesn't mean I'm right, you're wrong. It means that you've done sort of this cost benefit analysis and you've come across what is the right thing to do right here, right now in nature. And by nature, it really means your present, like your world, what's going on, what your team needs, what your business needs, what the customers need. Act with the right intention. One of the, I mean, I laugh and I shouldn't, but one of the funny things about Stoicism is it has this concept of memento mori, which is remember that we're all going to die. You are going to die. Everyone's going to die. And that sounds so morbid, but once you read up on these things, you realize it's really saying, like, you have this life. Make your decisions knowing that you're not going to live forever, knowing that you're not always going to be healthy. Make your decisions also, though, based on the concept that this project, this team right now, is probably not going to be the team you're working with 10 years from now. It might not even be the team you're working with 10 months from now. Is that you should meditate, which in this context just means think about, consider, ponder that where we are right now will eventually come to some end. Whether or not you believe in an afterlife or anything like that, the life you have right now will likely come to an end of some point. And maybe you believe it'll transition to something else. And maybe you believe that's it, you're done. So that brings us to live here and now, because that's the only place you're living here now. It means don't spend too much time meditating on the past. Don't spend too much time being anxious about the future. But of course, you can still have memories and you can still plan. This play the roles assigned by nature is not a call to women should be in the kitchen and men should work. That's not what that means. That just means do the things that you can do and don't try to do things that, you know, either are outside your responsibility, like focus on doing the role you have right now in life. And we all have multiple roles. Be useful to others, anticipate difficulties, which means don't let them creep up on you. Think for yourself. Don't be overly influenced by celebrities or famous people or people with lots of blog followers or people with a lot of Twitter followers. More about contemplate what's going on around you. And then my favorite one is love your fate. No matter what's going on in your life right now, you should embrace it about that is your nature. That is your life right now. It doesn't mean you like it. It really doesn't mean you love it. It means you are alive and you're going through this. This is going to change you, but it will get better in the end, which is what everyone told me who had been through what I do. So another great quote is the root of suffering is that we suffer, we have pain, we worry, we find stress from, that's what the suffering means, not from what's going on around us, but for our judgment about them, which is, we're going to talk about later in a couple of slides, but basically suffering is caused not so much by what's happening at us or to us, even though that can be painful and legitimately stressful, but the ongoing suffering is based on how we respond to that. This is one of the hardest things for me to learn, which was I was dwelling in my suffering, and that's a common thing to happen. I still love that former self of me that sat most of the days and nights on my sofa, like just in that what the heck had just happened, but I did that for months, maybe years, because I was allowing that suffering, my reaction to what had happened a year ago, continue to give me pain. So there's also modern things that are being written about Stoicism, and I love this. A Stoic is a Buddhist with attitude, because prior to studying Stoicism, I had been studying a little bit about Buddhism and Hinduism and some of these other religions / frameworks, depending on how you think of them. And another great resource for modern Stoicism is there's a book called The Obstacle is the Way. The obstacle is the way means don't try to live in a space that isn't really true. Embrace the obstacles that are thrown at you, be courageous and work through them. So since we're talking about Buddhism, this was for me one of the most life-changing things that I had read. It's one of those things, so I call this a blinding glimpse of the obvious. A blinding glimpse of the obvious for me is something that someone tells you that you've never thought of or heard of before, and you're like, bam, like, that makes so much sense. I don't know why I haven't thought about that. And then once you process it, you're like, that's so true and so obvious. I can't believe I didn't know that. So blinding glimpse of the obvious. So the Four Noble Truths from Buddhism, and these, of course, all of these statements I'm making, again, not an expert, these things were not written in English, so the translations can widely vary just along a lot of other ancient writings. But the Four Noble Truths are pretty much that all life is suffering. And that sounds horrible, doesn't it? Like, why? But again, some of the translations for suffering in this can be stressful, can be annoying, can be worrying, like as in rubbing something, worrying this. But the second noble truth is that the cause of this suffering is your attachment to things. I also have a big problem with that. But it's really, this attachment is really speaking of your pain, a lot of it, and the ongoing suffering is caused by your attachment to what happened in the past, or your attachment to how you want the world to be, but it's not that way, and you're constantly suffering because it's not that way. So people will tell me, Karen, why do you live in Canada? You live in a place where the weather hurts your face for a big chunk of the months. And I'm kind of like, and I love that. I love that I have a variety of seasons. Yes, right now I'm heavily looking forward to spring, and it's not going to be spring here for a little bit. And indeed, we can't even plant outside here until the end of May. And we might get snow as late as the first week of June. It would be a light snow, but it has happened. So attachment to wanting things to be the way they're not is definitely the big cause of suffering in a lot of people's life. The fourth truth is that good news, there's a way to end all this suffering. And the fourth is, and we can do this via the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path, again, these things get translated a lot of different ways, is right. So the path to getting away from the suffering is to have the right understanding of the situations, right understanding, always having the right intention of what you do, to make sure you use the right speech. And remember, we're using the word right here, not as right and wrong, but as the appropriate speech. So for instance, when I argued with the DBA about the sex and gender tables that I had in a database, I tried to keep using the words about this is a customer requirement. And by the way, we're also implementing things in this database that I don't, necessarily believe is the way the world should work. But we're implementing it because it's a requirement, it's legal, it's actually good for the customers to have this. So same thing goes with having the right action. The right livelihood is really looking at, not just your job, but the right balance between your home, your work, your volunteering, all of those things, the right amount of effort. I know in my past, some of the mistakes I made here is I spent way too much time saying and thinking about all the awful things that were done to me during this downtime in my life. I felt a need to do that, but looking back on it now, I know that that wasn't the right path. It felt good, but it wasn't helping end my suffering. It was actually delaying it. The right mindfulness. So mindfulness sometimes means, like formal meditation, either associated with a religion or associated with a belief system. I tend to use mindfulness to just be hyper aware of what's going on right now. People who meditate on a regular basis, they don't make a big distinction between sitting on a cushion and meditating and just the bringing that practice into their everyday life. So there's no one right way to meditate. There's no one right way to do it, but certainly taking a breath when you're in a conflicting situation and looking at people's faces, their body language, listening to their words, but also listening to what they show you. This mindfulness about what's going on can really help. And then the right amount of concentration. So I took this Buddhism theory and I've applied it to data. And I say that all data is suffering. And with apologies to the Buddha, I say all data is suffering. It's stressful. It can be unsatisfying. Data does things and people believe things about data that just aren't true. But the cause of data suffering is attachment to a world that we want it to be a certain way, but it's not that way. And you can't change the world by changing your database design to somehow force that on people. I mean, the example I use is my father was born without a middle name, very common in Hispanic cultures. And he never picked up middle names along the way some people do. So he just has no middle name. But the number of database systems, especially government ones, that force him to have a name means that he has middle names like none everywhere. That's just silly that these days that a information system would require people to have a middle name or a last name or a first name, because there are plenty of people who don't have those things. Some of the cure to this data suffering is not to be attached to the things you have no control. If something needs to be fixed in the data, then you work through the parts of the team or the structure that you do control, such as escalating or taking the right speech and the right actions to lead people to understand that the world doesn't work that way, to try to break that attachment. And I know that's something it took me a long time to learn. As I discovered these things about names and addresses and people, I learned that I can't be overly attached to the world as I see it. I need to be attached to doing the right action. So the solution to data suffering is to take the right path. And the right path is all the things I just talked about: using the right speech, the right intention, the right concentration, being mindful of what's going on. Like I can say that not all people have a first name, not all people have a middle name, not all people have a last name. Now, if I translate that into a typical database design, almost always the database design is going to have first name and last name as required, because that's what the business wants. So people, for instance, a good friend of mine from Indonesia who was born without a last name, they don't typically they only have a first name, or what we would call a first name. So when she moved to the US, she had to give herself a last name because she couldn't get a driver's license, couldn't rent an apartment, couldn't do anything because the systems would not tolerate. But making a middle name required is just silly. Like technically right now, I no longer have a middle name because of some confusion with the multiple middle names I have, and the first passport I got led to multiple middle names showing up on my records in the wrong order with the wrong names and the wrong initials. So I just gave up my middle names to make my life easier. And yeah, lots of systems still have some version of my middle name, and most of them are wrong. Some examples of data suffering that happens is, I've alluded to this, the data performance versus data quality conflict that are naturally put on us. The people who are team data versus team code. So again, data people and developers, doing something really fast versus doing it right. This is a constant, it's a conflict, but it's also a balance that teams need to find. To do the right thing, to have the right path, is we have to do the cost, benefit, and risk between doing it fast and doing it right. The other one, my favorite, is production down versus fail fast. So lots of organizations use fail fast, but they are typically software companies that are free to add features, take them out, add them, try to see if they work. If they don't work well, or if people aren't using them, they can take them out. But if you're building a point of sale system or an insurance system, almost everything you put into the system is required by law. So you can't just say, well, people don't like sales tax, so we're going to take sales tax out of our system. And that constant battle, that constant conflict is not a bad thing. It just is. So we need to be mindful to work with that. Just remember, so through Stoicism and Buddhism, we've learned that suffering doesn't come from what's happening. Suffering comes from how we respond to it. So if I'm suffering because this DBA won't deploy the sex and gender tables, I don't want to get attached to being right. I want to get attached to making sure that the database meets the executive's requirements. And eventually I got that done. Trying to change the DBA's mind was not going to be a good use of my time, as much as I wanted to bring him into this century. We are both in my world, DBAs are right, devs are right, data architects are right. But what's right for the team, what's right for the system, is something we need to collaborate on and decide with the business. Another thing from Stoicism, which just all follow, these quotes are just gonna they're like reinforcement of what we've talked about. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, your judgment of it, your attachment to it. And this you have the power to revoke or improve on at any time. Just remember that. Your suffering on the long term is because of your attachment to wanting things to be that aren't there. The other one that it just took me so long to learn is that the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. In other words, living well is the best revenge. And in fact, revenge in itself is a destructive emotion. And this is a way of turning that around, is saying, if you want to get revenge on people, don't spend any time looking at them. Don't spend any time thinking about them. Live well, do the right thing, take the right paths, live well, be successful at what you do. And that's the best revenge. We're back to memento mori. I always leave this one in just because I think it's cute, is just keep remembering you are your soul caring about a corpse. So one of the other things that crushed me during this time was my feelings about my body and my body image. I was harassed about my hair color. I was harassed about my weight. About my age, about what I look like, about what I wore to events. All of these are things I was harassed about and bullied about. in this weird world where I loved this community, but people were free to do all those things and there were no consequences of them. But I can't change those people. I can't change those bullies. All I can do is embrace my purple hair or pink or red or whatever it is. I can choose to not hate my body. I still don't love it that much, but I don't hate it anymore, no matter what anyone told me. It just is. And I can take actions to change that, and I try to. But that's what I have control over. I don't have control over what other people think about my hair color or my body or the fact that I wear glasses or the fact that I'm 58 years old. Like, I don't have control over any of that. I'm just a little soul carrying around a corpse. And I know that sounds morbid and weird, but I think that's such a great concept. Leo Tolstoy said, we can know only that we know nothing, and that is the highest degree of human wisdom. Quotes like these are often attributed to Socrates, to other great thinkers. It's very common. I mean, this just happens to be a quote from War and Peace. It doesn't mean he stole it. It doesn't mean he's the original person. Again, all of these great thoughts come at us from all kinds of sources that over the decades and centuries, people have figured out these are good thoughts for getting through the day. So this is how I think of my practice. So also one of the tenets of a lot of these things is this concept of practice. And practice means, in some senses, just what you do every day. What is your practical way of living the day? But it also means practice as in, like practice when I train to run, or practice when I practice speaking. It can mean all of those things. My practices are trying to apply these concepts to everything I do in life. So in one of my talks about negotiation skills, I talk about practice negotiating in little tiny places of the world. So negotiating a discount with someone, buying something at a yard sale, trading off chores at home. Practice negotiating so that when you go to negotiate your salary, it's not all 100% new to you. The more you practice things in little pieces of your life, like having the right response to something, the easier it is to do in the bigger things of your life. So the analogy I always use is I stub my toes all the time. I am the biggest klutz ever. And I stub my toes on everything. And the initial feelings, the initial emotions that I have, I would call them destructive. I am a big believer of letting out a slew of really bad words to get that stress out of my body. And by the way, there is some research that shows that if you cuss in situations like that, it does help you with the pain. I'm not sure that study is double-blind peer reviewed, but I'm going to latch onto it. Is that I am initially angry when that happens. I'm angry at the table I stubbed my toe on. I'm angry at me for being a klutz. I'm angry at my toes for hurting. But we generally deal with this okay, because after that wave of pain and anger washes over us, we're like, okay, holding on to that anger is just stupid. The table isn't going to change. My toe's not going to change. And I can try to be more careful, but after 58 years of living, I know I'm not going to change. And poof, that anger goes away, and the pain in my foot still feels bad, and I might lose a toenail later because of it. But that kind of turns to me laughing at myself for being angry at the table, angry at my toe, and angry at me. And so I'm not saying go stub your toes all the time, but the more you practice this feeling the emotions are not bad. Even destructive emotions aren't bad unless we let them influence our actions further than they need to. So when someone tells me that all nulls are evil, I can say, okay, I've heard this argument before. I have all of these questions to ask the person who tells me all nulls are evil. And I can go through this because I've had practice having this discussion. So I turn that discussion into cost, benefit, and risk of having a nullable column. Okay, so if we make it not null, what are we going to use for people's middle name? Well, what if we use the letter null, like the word null, instead of a null indicator? Okay, but there are people named null, so that's not going to work. What do you want to do? You want to put none in there? What if none is an actual middle name? What if, and if we use n/a for not applicable, then everything we do with that data, self-serve BI, integrations, every single system that we integrate this data with is going to have to know to process that faux null in a different way. So we just have to do the cost, benefit, and risk. And because I'm not attacking people for saying something that I disagree with, but taking a logical right path, at least we can have a professional discussion about it. So practicing these responses is really helpful. The other thing I realize is in all design, and I'm talking about design mostly because that's primarily what I do around data, is everything is debatable. Every single thing I do in data is debatable. That just means every single design decision comes down to cost, benefit, and risk. That's all that means. So people try to live in a world where there's no discord, there's no passion, there's no debate, probably are just following practices that may or may not be the right actions with the right intentions. I also tend to say that this is because I think of the world as a giant data modeling problem. All problems are data modeling problems. They all come down to that. And the only thing I really mean by that is having the right understanding about conflict and understanding about what the agreement or disagreement is will get you thousands of miles further down the right path. I've said this lots of times, everything comes down to cost, benefit, and risk. Revenge is not needed. Living the best life, that's the only revenge you need. That one was really hard for me to like, I would read it and I'd be like, yeah, that sounds good. But to really internalize it and practice that, boy, that it has paid off so well, but it also is something that I'm continuing to improve on. We also want, I stole this from my Peloton classes, we want to practice. It's a practice, but we don't need to be perfect. People will tell me, oh, I can't meditate because, I can't make my mind blank. Well, guess what? Meditating isn't about making your mind blank. And there is no perfect meditation and no one is perfect. And there's no such thing as a good meditation. There's just doing it, trying to be mindful of what's going on around us. And then this one I have learned and relearned, and most of us have over our life. What you actually do, the actions you take, both in private and in public, tells me about your ethics and beliefs, not what you say. I'm working on a contentious team right now where people who are frustrated right now with the rules and the governance are just ignoring them and going on and doing stuff that they think needs to be done, but they don't have the right context to know that they used the wrong data, that they used the wrong data source, that they used an old version, that they used it in a way it wasn't meant to be used. And now we're trying to respond to, you can tell me you're going to follow our governance, but until you do that, you're not following our governance. So some tips I have. Some of these things that I've dealt with you, that I've shared with you, are going to help. Or you can go find your own things from these frameworks that really help you. Like I embrace the memento mori, and even though it's morbid, I find it fun to think of my life that way, of a soul, a little soul carrying around a corpse. Very few of the things that I've told you are going to fix your problems or treat your problems or fix your depression or my depression. It's just up to you to find things that fix, because there are other things that people say to help you get through your day, like drink lots of water, stand up every hour, get 30 minutes of exercise, go outside, be with people or don't be with people. All of those things do indeed help most people, but they're not fixes to really deep, mind-blowing, crushing events. But oh my gosh, I couldn't have gotten through what I did without these little helps along the way. I also want to remind you that your emotions are valid, they're real. You should not deny how you feel, but you also shouldn't let them get in the way of doing the right thing. When I was going through the betrayal and the harassment and bullying, what I was really going through was grief, real grief. And it was a friend of mine who had recently lost her husband tragically that helped me understand that while I was not a grieving widow, I was still grieving the loss of my future life. I was grieving the loss of a community that I loved that had betrayed me as well. And I feel like once I understood, do the things you control and don't worry about the things you can't, just do the right thing. The other tip I have is if you're in a debate with somebody about the right thing to do, like on a team, if you can explain the cost, benefit, and risk of not just your position, but all the other positions, management is going to be heck of impressed by that, because it shows you're looking at this in a logical way. If you can say, let's just make all columns, no column can be longer than 25 characters because big databases perform worse. If you can explain the cost, benefit, and risk of that particular design decision, which I would not agree to, management's going to realize that you are coming across this debate in a logical, less emotional way than someone on the other side of the table is saying, well, that's the way we always did it at the bank and it worked really well. Remember that the best revenge is living well, that context is so important about what is right, especially in our data jobs. Just because Microsoft says it's a best practice, or Karen says nulls are not evil, or a DBA says no one's going to call you in the middle of the night for a data quality issue, but they're going to call us for a performance issue. Like, all of those things are true and right, but the thing that is right for the project takes all of that context in place, and that you should be constantly practicing taking the right path. So that's all I had. I wish I could share with you like so many more quotes, so many more things that I dug up, but I wanted to get you started in looking at some great thought leaders in the world that help me get through my day every day.
Karen, I have a question.
Sure.
You talked about practicing negotiation in small ways so that it can help in big ways.
Yeah.
That was really useful to me because I'm really very poor at that. I come from a very conflict-ridden home, and I look for harmony like really quickly. I find that, sometimes I feel threatened when people come across as too argumentative or loud on the other side. Mm-hmm. Do you have any tips on how you deal with that?
That feeling of
feeling intimidated by they may not even be intending it that way, but sometimes it feels that.
Well, so the specific tip about practicing negotiating was just an example of something I practice at the small level. So when it comes time to do it at a big level, I can do that. If I was negotiating, let's say I'm negotiating with the devs and the DBAs about whether or not an email column should be 255 characters, which is my position on it, because that's what the internet standard says, is that, again, that being able to explain to them that I hear what they're saying, that I understand why they're saying it. It is true. Most data architects do not get a call in the middle of the night because the report's not adding up, because the data's bad. But the DBAs might, or the developers might. And so I recognize that there are other roles on my teams that get measured and rewarded and compensated based on performance, whereas I get rewarded based on data quality. And they don't measure performance of in the database for me,
Mhm.
is that the better I can show them that I hear them, that I understand their position, and I'm going to say, but I think this is the best way. What are we going to do when that customer comes in with a 200-character email address and our database only allows 50? Like, what's our workaround going to be? That's sort of a logical, I say impersonal, meaning not making it personal. It's not about right or wrong. It's like, let's turn this into a real world story. But I hear you. It's hard.
Thank you. Anyone have any other questions for Karen?
Or I'm just going to look at the chat to see. Oh, there's all good stuff in the chat.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, it's snowing in Ottawa. Thank you, Gail.
I also like the line that some people attribute to the Buddha. There's so many things attributed to the Buddha, you never know.
I know.
But one line, the pain is a given, but suffering is optional. I think my therapist told me that.
Yes, and
I love that.
That also comes from other writers as well. It's funny. Yes. One of a quote that was very similar to it that I heard the other day is, it's okay to hate the snow, but you're still going to be snowy and hateful.
That's funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
And your soul carrying the corpse, that is just so funny, so hilariously.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I love it. Some people hate that aspect of it. I embrace it. I think we're at 9 now. So
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope this helped. I'd love to hear if it helped you at all.